the country whose title I've been so greatly privileged to bear during so much of my life and duty.
And then, after finally reaching the throne, he was forced to confront an entirely different kind of duty, the duty to serve while also protecting his own strength. That contradiction is what makes this moment so powerful. The monarch is still the monarch. The crown still rests with Charles. But public attention has shifted sharply toward William, not because the Prince of Wales has made a dramatic grab for power, but because the institution naturally looks to its next pillar when the current one appears vulnerable. In any royal family, succession is not only a legal line. It is an emotional shadow. It is always there, even when nobody wants to speak about it too loudly. Prince William, the Prince of Wales, now stands in one of the most delicate positions of his life. He must reassure the public without appearing to replace his father. He must look prepared without looking impatient. He must be visible enough to strengthen the monarchy, but careful enough not to make King Charles seem diminished. That is a difficult balance for any heir, but it is especially difficult when the story involves illness, family loyalty, and a nation still sensitive to the memory of Queen Elizabeth II's final years. For many viewers, this is where the emotion begins. They are not only watching titles and schedules, they are watching a father and son move through a public chapter filled with private meaning. Charles is not just a king in this story. He is a parent whose life's work is being measured against time, health, and legacy. William is not just the future king. He is a son who must carry more responsibility while still showing respect for the man who came before him. That emotional tension cannot be captured by a single palace statement. And then there is Catherine, Princess of Wales. Her presence adds another layer to the story because Catherine herself has faced a serious health journey in recent years, and her gradual return to public life has been watched with sympathy and concern. For many royal observers, Catherine represents steadiness, family discipline, and a quieter kind of strength. When she appears beside William, the image is never only about husband and wife. It is about the future shape of the monarchy, the next royal household, and the public's need to believe that continuity is not only possible, but already being carefully protected. Still, the palace must tread carefully. If it says too little, speculation grows. If it says too much, it risks making the king's health the center of every royal conversation. That is the difficult space Buckingham Palace now occupies, protecting Charles's dignity while also preparing the public for a monarchy in which William and Catherine may become increasingly central. It is not a simple transition. It is a slow test of trust. Queen Camilla also cannot be ignored in this first chapter. As the king's wife, she stands closest to the personal side of the crisis. Publicly, she represents loyalty and continuity beside Charles. Privately, though no one outside the palace can claim to know her thoughts, royal commentators often note that her position is deeply tied to the king's own role. If Charles reduces his duties, if his public life changes, if William takes on more visible leadership, Camilla's place in the emotional architecture of the monarchy also begins to shift. That does not mean conflict is certain, but it does mean the family structure is changing in ways that are both symbolic and human. This is why the shocking exit headline has gained such force. It speaks to a fear many royal viewers already feel but may not say directly, that the reign of King Charles III could become defined not by ceremony and celebration, but by illness adaptation and the early rise of the next generation. Was this always going to be a shorter, transitional reign? Was William always destined to become the emotional center of the monarchy sooner than expected? And if palace observers are right, are we now watching the first signs of that reality unfold in public? Yet the answer is not simple. The monarchy has survived because it knows how to move slowly, even when the world around it demands instant clarity. It does not always announce change in one dramatic sentence. Sometimes, it allows change to appear through routine, through duty, through who steps forward when the cameras are waiting. And that may be exactly what makes this moment so important. Because the real story may not be that King Charles has exited. The real story may be that Prince William has begun entering a new phase of royal responsibility while still standing in his father's shadow. And once that possibility appears, the question becomes far more sensitive. Was this simply a response to health and circumstance, or was the monarchy quietly preparing for the future long before the public noticed? For a few seconds, the palace story seemed simple. Another headline, another dramatic claim, another wave of speculation around King Charles III and Prince William, the Prince of Wales. But beneath the words "shocking exit" was a more unsettling question. Was the monarchy facing a sudden break, or was the future quietly moving into place before the public fully understood it? The phrase itself was enough to stop royal watchers in their tracks, because in the British royal family, language is rarely accidental. An exit does not always mean abdication. It does not always mean a throne being given up, a crown being removed, or a reign coming to an official end. Sometimes, in royal life, an exit begins more quietly than that. It begins with a reduced schedule, fewer public appearances, duties passed to another pair of hands, and a palace tone that becomes careful, controlled, and unusually guarded. That is why this latest conversation around King Charles III matters so deeply. Buckingham Palace has not publicly confirmed that the king is abdicating, nor has it announced a permanent departure from the throne. Those are important facts, and they should not be blurred. But facts alone do not explain why so many people are watching Prince William so closely. The deeper story is not simply whether the monarch is leaving. The deeper story is whether the monarchy has already begun adjusting itself around a future that everyone knew would come one day, but perhaps not with this much emotional pressure. When King Charles III was diagnosed with cancer, the announcement changed the atmosphere around the crown. It did not only raise questions about health, it raised questions about endurance, continuity, and the emotional weight of a reign that had only recently begun. Charles had waited most of his life to become king. 4 decades, he was the heir, the man preparing for a role that belonged to history long before it belonged to him personally. To understand why that question matters, we have to look beyond the headline and into the way royal power actually moves. It rarely moves with noise. It moves through responsibility. It moves through visibility. It moves through the quiet expectation that one person will step forward when another can no longer carry the same public weight as before. And in that sense, the conversation around William is not only about his father's health. It is about the monarchy testing the shape of its own future. 4 years, the Prince of Wales existed in a familiar position. He was important, but not yet central. He represented continuity, but he did not have to embody it fully. He could speak as a future king, support major causes, appear beside Catherine, and take on serious royal duties while still remaining one step removed from the heaviest burden of the crown. But illness changed the emotional geometry of the royal family. Once Charles's public schedule became more carefully managed, William's presence began to carry a different meaning. He was no longer simply the heir waiting in the background. He became, in the eyes of many observers, the visible reassurance that the institution had another steady figure ready to stand forward. That is where the story becomes more complicated, because readiness is not the same as desire. No serious royal watcher would suggest that William wants his father weakened or displaced. The emotional tension is the opposite. The future king must prepare for a role that, by its nature, arrives through loss. Every step toward the throne brings him closer to history, but also closer to a painful family reality. That is why this moment cannot be understood as ambition. It must be understood as duty moving faster than anyone may have wished. And duty, inside the monarchy, is never only personal. It is also strategic. When the public sees William attending major engagements, supporting national moments, or standing beside senior figures, the message is not always spoken directly, but it is understood. The monarchy is saying, without saying too much, that continuity remains intact. The crown may be under strain, but the line continues. The institution may adapt, but it does not collapse. For older viewers who remember the late Queen's long reign, that kind of reassurance carries powerful emotional weight. Yet reassurance also creates pressure. The more William is seen as the stabilizing figure, the more every movement he makes becomes part of a larger story. If he appears calm, some interpret it as strength. If he appears serious, others read it as burden. If he takes on more duties, people ask whether the transition is already beginning. If he steps back to protect his family, critics wonder whether the monarchy can carry the workload. This is the impossible public trap of being the heir during a period of uncertainty. Whatever he does, it becomes a signal. Some royal commentators believe this is why Kensington Palace and Buckingham Palace must now move with unusual care. They cannot allow the public to feel there is a vacuum at the top. But they also cannot allow the future king to appear as though he is overshadowing the current monarch. That balance is delicate because Charles is not a symbolic figure to be quietly moved aside. He is the reigning king, a man who waited decades to fulfill a constitutional and personal destiny. His dignity matters not only to him, but to the legitimacy of the institution itself. This is why the language around a shocking exit can be so misleading, yet still emotionally revealing. It may not describe a confirmed constitutional event, but it does capture a public anxiety. People sense that something has shifted. They may not know exactly what to call it. They may not know whether it is temporary, gradual, or part of a longer transformation. But they can see that the royal family is now operating under a different kind of pressure, one shaped by health, generational change, and the unspoken question of who carries the monarchy when the king must conserve his strength. There is also the matter of history. The British monarchy has always depended on the illusion of seamless continuity. One reign ends, another begins. One generation fades, another appears. But real life is never that clean. Behind every smooth transition are human beings dealing with fatigue, grief, uncertainty, and the fear of public judgment. Charles's situation reminds the nation that monarchy is both ancient and fragile. It rests on ceremony, law, and tradition, but it is carried by bodies that age, families that suffer, and private lives that cannot always be separated from public duty. That is why William's role feels heavier now. He is not merely preparing for a future coronation. He is being asked, gradually and perhaps reluctantly, to represent steadiness while the present reign navigates illness. And for a man who has often spoken through action more than dramatic statements, that responsibility may be most visible in what he does rather than what he says. A carefully chosen appearance, a composed public moment, a calm presence beside Catherine, a respectful reference to his father, all of these become part of the quiet language of royal transition. But the question that follows is even more sensitive. If William is becoming more central, what happens to everyone around him? Catherine's role becomes more important, not only as his wife, but as the emotional partner in the next chapter of royal life. Queen Camilla's position becomes more complex because her public identity is deeply connected to Charles's reign and personal well-being. Senior working royals, including Princess and the Princess Royal, may be watched more closely as the monarchy relies on trusted figures to maintain rhythm and confidence. Even the distant presence of Prince Harry, the Duke of Sussex, and Meghan Markle, the Duchess of Sussex, remains part of the wider conversation because questions of family unity, absence, and public trust never fully disappear from the royal story. And this is where viewers may begin to ask a more uncomfortable question. Was the monarchy already preparing for this kind of strain, or has Charles's illness forced a faster adjustment than the palace expected? According to some observers, the institution has spent years trying to modernize without looking unstable. Fewer working royals, tighter public messaging, and a stronger focus on the Wales family all suggested a streamlined future. But a streamlined monarchy becomes more vulnerable when multiple senior figures face health challenges at the same time. The fewer people carrying the crown, the heavier each burden becomes. That burden now seems to sit most visibly on William's shoulders, not because he has taken the crown, and not because the king has left it behind, but because the public imagination has begun to move ahead of the official story. People are not only watching what is happening today, they are watching for clues about tomorrow. They want to know whether this is a temporary adjustment or the first stage of a deeper royal transformation. And once that question enters the room, the story moves into far more sensitive territory. Because behind the visible duties, the carefully managed appearances, and the respectful public language, another issue begins to emerge. If William is becoming the monarchy's most important symbol of continuity, then the person standing beside him may become just as important to the future as the future king himself. That is why Catherine's place in this story cannot be treated as a side detail. In moments of royal uncertainty, the public does not only look at the person next in line. It looks at the household forming around that person, the emotional tone they project, and the kind of future they seem to represent. William may carry the constitutional shadow of the next reign, but Catherine increasingly carries something just as important, the image of steadiness that makes that future feel acceptable. This is not simply about popularity. Royal popularity can rise and fall with headlines, photographs, and public mood. Catherine's significance is deeper, because she has become associated with restraint, family order, and quiet endurance at a time when the monarchy has been tested by illness, distance, and unresolved family tensions. When she appears beside William, the public is not merely seeing a royal couple. They are seeing a preview of a future royal court, one built less around grand declarations and more around discipline, loyalty, and emotional control. And that is where the hidden dynamic begins to appear. If William's role is expanding because circumstances have placed more weight on him, then Catherine's role expands with it. Not through a formal announcement, not through a dramatic palace decision, but through the subtle logic of monarchy itself. The heir's household becomes more important when the king's household is under strain. The future queen becomes more closely watched when the future king is seen as the figure of reassurance. And every public appearance becomes more than a duty. It becomes a test of whether the next generation can carry the institution without making the present monarch look diminished. Some royal watchers believe this is one reason the Wales family has been so carefully positioned in recent years. William and Catherine are often presented as modern but not radical, accessible but not careless, emotional but still controlled. That balance matters because the monarchy cannot survive by tradition alone. It must also persuade the public that the next chapter feels stable, familiar, and worthy of trust. In that sense, the Prince and Princess of Wales are not simply representing themselves. They are representing the monarchy's argument for its own continuation. But there is a contradiction beneath that polished image. The more William and Catherine become symbols of the future, the more pressure gathers around them in the present. The public may want reassurance, but reassurance has a cost. It leaves very little room for weakness, privacy, or ordinary family strain. Catherine's own health journey made that cost painfully visible. For months, the public was reminded that even the most composed royal figures are human beings first, and yet the institution still required calm, timing, and carefully managed communication. That tension between human vulnerability and public duty sits at the center of this entire story. It also changes how people interpret the king's position. Charles remains the monarch, and Buckingham Palace has not publicly confirmed the dramatic claims of a final royal exit. But the public conversation has already moved beyond official language. People are asking what happens when the emotional center of the monarchy begins to shift before the constitutional center has changed. That is a very different question from abdication. It is quieter, more complicated, and perhaps more revealing. Because monarchy depends on symbols, and symbols often move before titles do. A balcony arrangement can suggest hierarchy. A major service can reveal who is trusted to carry the public mood. A carefully timed appearance can calm speculation more effectively than a written statement. Over time, these small details shape public instinct. They teach viewers where to look, whom to trust, and who seems ready when the next chapter arrives. That is why royal observers study not only speeches, but presence. Not only announcements, but atmosphere. This is also where Queen Camilla's role becomes more sensitive. Her public strength has been closely tied to Charles's reign, and her loyalty beside him has helped define the emotional character of his time as king. But if attention moves more sharply toward William and Catherine, Camilla's place in the public imagination may become more complicated. She remains queen, but the future does not belong to her household. That does not mean conflict must follow. It does mean the monarchy has to manage a delicate emotional balance, honoring the king and queen of today while preparing the public to invest emotionally in the king and queen of tomorrow. Princess, and may also become increasingly important in this kind of moment. The Princess Royal has long represented duty without performance, service without spectacle, and loyalty without needing the center of attention. In a smaller working monarchy, figures like and become valuable because they provide continuity without creating rivalry. Her presence reassures traditional royal viewers that the old language of service has not disappeared, even as the Wales family becomes more central to the future. Yet the family tension surrounding Prince Harry and Meghan Markle cannot be completely separated from this wider picture. They are not the main characters in this particular chapter, but their absence still matters because a slimmed-down monarchy has fewer spare pillars. When senior figures step away, when others face health challenges, and when public trust becomes more fragile, every fracture inside the family becomes part of the institution's larger problem. Was the monarchy prepared for a future with fewer working royals, Or did it underestimate how heavy that burden would become when crisis arrived? That question leads to the larger pattern. The British royal family appears to be moving through a period where power is not being seized, but redistributed by necessity. Duties shift, visibility shifts, public expectation shifts, and slowly, without any single moment that can be pointed to as the turning point, the emotional architecture of the monarchy begins to change. Charles may still wear the crown, but William and Catherine increasingly carry the public imagination of what comes next. And once that becomes clear, the story moves beyond health, headlines, or palace wording. It becomes a question of preparation. Who inside the royal family understood first that the future was no longer distant? Who recognized that the monarchy could not wait until the last moment to teach the public where stability would come from next? Because the real question was no longer whether William was stepping forward. It was whether the palace had quietly begun building the next reign in plain sight. If the palace has been building the next reign in plain sight, then the most important turning point is not a single announcement. It is the moment the public begins to believe it, and that belief can be more powerful than any official statement, because monarchy survives not only through law and ceremony, but through confidence. Once people begin looking at William and Catherine as the emotional center of the future, the institution has to manage that perception with extraordinary care. This is where the pressure begins to rise. A monarchy can prepare quietly for transition, but it cannot appear to rush a reigning king toward the margins. Charles remains the sovereign, and that fact matters deeply. His reign carries its own dignity, its own story, and its own emotional claim on the public. But when every adjustment to his schedule is studied, every appearance is compared, and every increase in William's visibility is treated as a sign of what comes next, the palace is no longer only managing events. It is managing interpretation. That is a far more dangerous task than it first appears. If Buckingham Palace emphasizes Charles too strongly, it risks raising questions about whether the king is being pushed beyond his strength. If it places William too prominently, it risks inviting speculation that the future monarch is already stepping into the center before the present reign has had time to settle. And if the palace says too little, the silence becomes its own story. In royal life, absence can speak as loudly as presence, and sometimes the gap between the official message and public instinct becomes the place where the real drama unfolds. According to some royal commentators, this is why the monarchy's visible choreography has become so significant. Who attends an event is important, but who represents the family at moments of national feeling can matter even more. The person who appears when the country needs reassurance becomes associated with stability. The person who carries difficult public occasions becomes associated with leadership. The person who stands calmly in the frame when uncertainty is gathering becomes, over time, a symbol. And symbols, once formed, are difficult for any palace to control. For William, that symbolism carries risk. The future king cannot look uncertain, but he also cannot look too eager. He cannot distance himself from the burden, but he must not seem to take it from his father's hands. That is the strange cruelty of royal succession. The heir must prepare all his life for a role that only arrives through someone else's decline or death. So when the public watches William now, they are not merely measuring his readiness. They are watching him navigate one of the most emotionally complicated positions any royal can occupy, becoming more necessary while the king is still present. And the consequences do not stop with him. Catherine's recovery and gradual public presence have made the Wales household feel both strong and vulnerable at the same time. That combination is powerful because it invites sympathy, but it also creates expectation. Viewers want to see her well. They want to see the family steady. They want to believe the future is secure. Yet that public affection can quietly become pressure because every appearance begins to carry more meaning than the moment itself. A smile becomes reassurance. A pause becomes speculation. A return becomes a statement. Camilla's position is equally delicate. She has spent years standing beside Charles through judgment, controversy, acceptance, and finally kingship. But in a period when the public imagination is moving toward the Wales family, the Queen's role becomes more emotionally complex. She represents loyalty to the king and continuity within the present reign, while William and Catherine increasingly represent what comes after. The palace must honor both images without allowing one to diminish the other. That is not easy, because royal symbolism often works like a tide. It moves slowly, but once it turns, everyone feels the direction. This may be why princess and steady presence matters more than ever, and does not need to compete for attention because her public identity has long been built around service rather than image. In moments of institutional strain, figures like the Princess Royal act almost like anchors. They remind the public that duty still exists beyond personal drama, beyond generational change, beyond the noise of speculation. But even that reassurance points to a larger issue. A smaller monarchy depends heavily on fewer people, and when crisis touches more than one senior figure, the strain becomes harder to hide. The Sussex question adds another shadow to the picture. Harry and Meghan may be physically distant from the daily working monarchy, but the rupture surrounding them still affects how viewers understand the family's strength. In a broad royal sense, their absence is not just a personal estrangement. It has become part of the wider discussion about trust, loyalty, and whether the institution can afford internal fractures at a time when it needs unity most. This does not mean every royal health concern or public duty shift is connected to that family divide. But it does mean the monarchy's image of togetherness is being tested from several directions at once. That is the real escalation in this story. What began as a dramatic headline about a shocking exit has become something much more serious, a test of whether the public still believes the monarchy can manage uncertainty with dignity. The danger is not only that people might worry about the king's health. The danger is that they may begin to sense a gap between what is officially said and what they believe they are watching. And once that gap opens, every palace decision becomes more heavily scrutinized. Historically, the British crown has survived by turning personal hardship into public continuity. The late Queen's final years carried that same lesson. Her frailty was visible, but the institution remained composed, and the country was gradually prepared for a future it did not want to face. The difference now is timing. Charles's reign is still relatively young, and the emotional expectation surrounding it has not had decades to settle. That makes every sign of transition feel sharper, more sudden, and more vulnerable to interpretation. So the turning point may not be whether the king has made a formal exit. Buckingham Palace has not publicly confirmed that. The turning point may be that the public conversation has already moved into succession language, even while the official structure remains unchanged. William is not king. Catherine is not queen. Charles has not been publicly replaced. And yet, the emotional imagination of the monarchy appears to be shifting around them. That is why the next stage of this story matters so much, because the real consequence is not only what happens to Charles's schedule or how many duties William carries, or how carefully the palace words its next statement. The real consequence is what this moment reveals about the future image of the crown. And to understand what it truly means, we have to look at the one question still sitting at the center of everything. Is this a temporary adjustment around illness, or the beginning of a permanent change in how the monarchy wants the world to see its next chapter? That question is what gives the story its lasting weight, because the monarchy is rarely defined by one headline alone. It is defined by the meaning people attach to that headline after the first shock fades. If this is only a temporary adjustment around illness, then the palace's challenge is to protect the king's dignity, steady public nerves, and allow the normal rhythm of royal life to return without feeding unnecessary fear. But if it marks the beginning of a more permanent shift in public expectation, then something larger is already underway, something quieter than abdication, but still deeply consequential. The crown does not always change through dramatic declarations. Sometimes it changes through habit. The public becomes used to seeing one figure more often. Broadcasters begin framing him as the natural voice of reassurance. Commentators start measuring the next chapter before the current one has closed. Over time, the future stops feeling theoretical and begins to feel present. That may be the most important implication surrounding William now. Not that he has replaced Charles, and not that Buckingham Palace has confirmed a final exit, but that the public conversation has started to treat him as the monarchy's central insurance policy. That is a powerful position, but it is not a comfortable one. For William, the future crown has always been both inheritance and burden. It represents history, duty, and national continuity, but it also carries the private sorrow of knowing that his rise can never be separated from his father's decline. That is why this moment feels different from ordinary royal preparation. It is not simply about training, titles, or public engagements. It is about the emotional cost of becoming necessary before the family may feel ready for that necessity. For Charles, the meaning is just as complex. A monarch wants to be seen as steady, not managed, present, not protected, respected, not quietly reduced to a symbol while others carry the visible weight. That is why palace language matters so much. The king's position must be safeguarded not only constitutionally, but emotionally. If the public begins to view every adaptation as evidence of fading authority, the reign risks being remembered less for service and more for uncertainty. But if the palace manages the moment with honesty and restraint, Charles may instead be seen as a monarch who faced personal vulnerability while keeping the institution intact. That distinction matters for legacy. Charles's reign was never going to resemble the reign of Queen Elizabeth II. Her long presence became almost inseparable from the idea of stability itself. Charles inherited a different monarchy, smaller, more scrutinized, more emotionally exposed, and more vulnerable to the speed of modern opinion. His legacy may not depend on the length of his reign, but on whether he successfully guides the crown through a fragile period without allowing the public to lose confidence in what comes next. And this is where Catherine's place becomes part of the final meaning. The future of the monarchy is not carried by William alone. It is carried by the household that forms around him, the tone he and Catherine project, and the public belief that they can represent both tradition and renewal without turning the monarchy into something unrecognizable. Her presence offers a softer kind of authority, one rooted not in constitutional power, but in emotional trust. That trust could become one of the monarchy's most important assets in the years ahead. Camilla's position also reveals the human cost of institutional change. She remains tied to Charles's reign in a way no public strategy can separate. If the spotlight moves more strongly toward the Wales family, it does not erase her role, but it does alter the emotional balance around the royal household. The monarchy must find a way to honor the present without making the future feel impatient. It must show loyalty to the king while preparing viewers for the inevitability of succession. That is a delicate line, and how the palace walks it may shape public feeling more than any official schedule. The wider family question remains just as important. A monarchy built around fewer working royals must rely heavily on those who remain. And steady service, Camilla's loyalty, Catherine's calm, William's increasing visibility, and Charles's determination all become parts of the same public picture. But the absence of other one-central figures reminds viewers that family unity is not merely sentimental. It is strategic. When the institution is under strain, every fracture becomes more visible, and every loyal presence becomes more valuable. So what does the story ultimately reveal? It reveals that the monarchy may already be living through a transition of perception before any formal transition of power. The law may be clear, the titles may remain unchanged, and the palace may continue to reject dramatic interpretations through careful silence. But public imagination is not governed by law alone. It responds to symbols, patterns, and emotional instinct. And right now, many observers are watching those patterns closely. The final answer, then, may not be as simple as Charles is leaving or William is taking over. The more thoughtful answer is that the monarchy is entering a period where every step must serve two purposes at once: protect the king who reigns today, and prepare trust in the king who will one day follow. That is not scandal. It is succession in slow motion, shaped by health, duty, family feeling, and the unforgiving attention of the public. And perhaps that is why this moment feels so important. It reminds us that monarchy is never only about crowns, ceremonies, and balcony appearances. It is about time. It is about age. It is about the painful handover between generations. It is about a family trying to remain human while carrying an institution that demands composure even in uncertainty. So what do you think? Was this simply one royal development shaped by health and circumstance, or does it point to a much larger shift inside the monarchy? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this deep royal analysis, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our next documentary-style royal story. Because in the end, the most revealing royal changes are not always the ones announced loudly. Sometimes they are the ones the public begins to feel before the palace ever says the words.